Good afternoon. All right, so today we are looking at the Constitution, and so we got a little bit of context from that with Pauline Myers' cynical view, her cynical take on the Constitution. And you'll see, however, that there is quite a bit that is that's rather conservative about the Constitution. Nevertheless, you have enlightened components as well. So what I wanted to do is something a little bit different, is I want to ask you to put into three categories, all right? Either enlightened, conservative, or pragmatic. All right, we'll get into pragmatic here. So I want to, is everybody doing okay? Anybody have any questions? Let me know if you do, okay? Feel free to interrupt me. So here is my subjective definition. Enlightened, any element to this Constitution that is ostensibly designed to prevent tyranny. This includes methods of checks and balances of one branch of the government over another, any measure intended to ensure transparency or accountability of officials to the people or others, limitations to discretionary powers of rulers, and any powers vested in the most democratically elected body, in this case, the House of Reps. A blatant example of this is the Bill of Rights, ensuring basic rights, individual rights for the citizens. Okay, so that would be enlightened as you go through the Constitution. Okay, the second category is conservative. Any element to this Constitution that seems to conserve early modern or medieval notions of politics, like the following: power vested in a better sort or in an elite entrusted to use its own discretion without much accountability to the governed, power centralized in a strong central government agency, like a unitary government, as opposed to deliberately weakened and decentralized, as in the Confederacy, limited democracy, okay, strong executive and military resources that can curtail individuals' freedoms if someday possibly, in the name of order and stability. An example of this is that only one half of one branch originally consisted of popularly elected officials, and only by those granted citizen status to be able to vote for them. That's pretty conservative. Okay, we have the House Reps, you have the senators, you have the president, you have the president's cabinet, and you have the Supreme Court. That's five. And of the five, only the House Reps are directly elected by the citizens. Okay, so that's pretty conservative. And then pragmatic is practical. It's kind of amoral. It's not really political. It's just to address contingencies, things that could come up, certain situations, certain emergencies, certain needs, and that it provides just a practical application in resolving them. So inherently amoral, simply designed for expediency as a compromise between disparate factions, okay, or designed to address exigencies or emergencies that may arise in the future. An example of this, sadly, may be the tacit acceptance of slavery to placate the planter faction of the South and ensure their ratification of the Constitution. Okay, so pragmatic. So now I am going to stop sharing this. I'm going to show you my take. This one's fun to me for another reason, and that is I have students disagree with me on what category they might put something in, and I love it. But that is also why I want to ask that you not only name the clause under your list of enlightened, conservative, and pragmatic, but give at least one sentence. If you're right to the point, one sentence suffices, telling me why it's enlightened, why it's pragmatic, why it's conservative. All right. So I just was looking right at the very beginning. So for instance, in the preamble, we the people do ordain and establish this Constitution. Look at the aims. In order to form a more perfect union, that's conservative. The conservatives were always worried about union, stability of the whole. Okay, establish justice. I would say conservative. Ensure domestic tranquility. I think that's a euphemism for keeping the peace in the union. Again, conservative. Provide for the common defense. Conservative. Okay, and provide for the general welfare. So notice almost every aim of the preamble is conservative and having a more centralized, less democratic republic than we had before in our confederation. All right. But also what I omitted here is I should have put 4 dots, because then it also does contend and ensure liberty of our citizens. And so it does end with one enlightened purpose for the Constitution: to protect and ensure the liberty of the people. Okay, so I conveniently left that out. So enlightened. Sections 1 through 3. Laws require a majority by a 2-branch legislator, that is, at least the lower house, elected. The other is elected by state reps. So it's circuitously elected. You elect the state reps in each state, and then they elect the senators. Of course, that's not the case anymore. They're directly elected as of the 19-teens during the progressive movement. That changed. But initially, that's how it was. Okay. So I put that as enlightened because we have a republic, right? Like Rome. And the tribunes at the bottom were elected by the Roman people, the citizens. Above them, the senators were not. They were not directly elected by the citizenry. And they had a check over each other. Okay. And they represented different demographics. And so that was all in the name of Montesquieu, of balance, right? Of different factions. So I still thought that was enlightened. House reps elected for only 2 years. Okay, so that holds them accountable for just a short period of time, and they got to run again. They must be the inhabitant of the state that they represent. And that, I believe, is enlightened because they want you to be familiar with the people, with the circumstances in the area that you're ruling over. And not to mention, they want to be able to hold you accountable. So they could kind of say, you know, I know where you live, to their elected reps. And they have a power of impeachment, okay, with the president. Senators must be inhabitants of their states, and they're able to try impeachments on the president. So kind of checks and balances there. And the part that they must be inhabitants, I thought was enlightened. Section 4, Congress must assemble once per year. Many times in early modern era, parliaments did not meet for years. They had to be called forth by the crown. And now this is ensuring that they're more autonomous and they're not waiting on a president to tell them when they can and cannot meet. And they're taking the initiative, and that they, since we elected them into office, directly the House reps and indirectly the senators, it's their job to do their job and legislate. Then Section 5 says that from time to time, there should be published a journal of their proceedings, of what was said, who was for what on any given issue, so the people could read and find out what their elected reps are up to. So that's transparency, which is enlightened. Section 6 and 7, they shall attain no additional office. That happened in England. You could be in the Senate, and you could be in the Lord's cabinet or in the Privy Council as well. You can't do that here, right? It'd be a conflict of interest. And so no additional offices. And with a 2/3 vote, yes, the president can veto what the legislator writes, but with a 2/3 supermajority, they could override his veto. So all of that I put enlightened. Then conservative. Okay, you count free persons when you're doing taxes and when you're doing how many House reps. Remember, House rep is 1 for every 30,000 people. That's not very democratic, right? So you get a congressional district is of 30,000 citizens. So when you're counting the 30,000 citizens. And when you're deciding on the state tax revenue to give to the federal government, you were to count the citizens, all free persons, but not Native Americans, because they were marginalized. And also, you were to treat slaves as 3/5 of a person. Because so, of course, if you counted them as one person, you would get more House reps, right? Which the South wanted. But if you counted them as one person, you would have to pay more in taxes. So they compromised on them ridiculously, legally, being worth 3/5 of a person each. Okay, so and I put here also reminded you that they only got one rep for every 30,000 civilians. Okay, and not to mention just the obvious one is the states get to decide on citizenship. That was the same thing as in the Confederacy. We have a more unitary government with a stronger central government, and they didn't take the stand toward universal citizenship. So that ball was dropped. That can was kicked down the road for future generations to have to wrestle with. Okay, senators again were not directly elected, and then also in Section 5, when it says that they shall keep a journal and it shall be published from time to time, it says, except in cases in which in their judgment requires secrecy. So Congress can keep secrets from us. So I put that as conservative as well. Section 8, many strong powers from states to Congress. Okay, that's, yeah, Article 1, Section 8. That's a big one. That gives direct powers to the federal government, particularly to Congress, that the states no longer had. So to raise an army, to declare war, to collect federal taxation, taxes, to decide on weights and measures, to decide on bankruptcy laws, to put out a post office system. Some of them were very practical things that you could put down as pragmatic. But overall, giving these powers to the federal government and taking them from the states is rather a conservative section, Article 1, Section 8. And then there's another section where it specifically states may not engage in treaties with foreign countries or with one another. They may not print money, et cetera, et cetera. So this really curtailed, this new government, the power of the states. And that is relatively conservative to me, because strong unitary, one strong central government has been the case in point for a long, long time before this. All right. And then also conservative is they issued a 20-year gag rule on slavery. No one could take the floor in Congress and even mention slavery and try to bring up debate, discourse, much less any kind of a vote, for 20 years. Okay. Then pragmatic. I put necessary tasks. They have the power to suppress insurrections and repel invasions, to borrow money, to regulate interstate trade, to deal with bankruptcies and patents, and the post office system. Those all to me were pragmatic, just kind of practically oriented. All right. And then Article 2, that was all Article 1 with Congress. Article 2 is the executive, president and cabinet. Article 2 now, enlightened. The president must give an oath to the Constitution. So now this is not rule by man, right? This is the rule of law, whereby he subsumes his authority to the authority of the Constitution, that it must be abided by. So the oath to the Constitution, I think, is an enlightened facet. He approves and he executes the laws, but Congress passes them. So it's a part of the checks and balances, right? Inherent in the system, in the spirit of Montesquieu. So I put that as enlightened. And then he's a civilian leader over the armed forces. That is an enlightened concept, because too long in human history, you've had military leaders become the dictators of their country. And we wanted to separate that. We wanted to ensure that the military is subsumed under the authority of a civilian. Okay. Let's see here. It's hard to look at because it's cut off here. During appointments and treaties approved by the Senate. Well, I think that's part of the checks and balances again, is the president gets to make appointments and gets to send out ambassadors to make treaties. But those ambassadors and those that he puts in the as like under the Secretary of State, they are to be approved by the Senate in the spirit of checks and balances. Okay. The State of the Union address, I find a little bit enlightened, and I've had students put this as conservative, and I could see their point. To me, it's a great it's a great dance between the president and Congress. He or she gets up there and gives what are supposed to be suggestions as to what the Congress may want to tackle as far as issues. And also, of course, even the presidents have often given their 2 cents on what they would do on that given topic. And then they leave it politely to Congress to do as it pleases, because it's Congress that passes the laws, not the president. Okay. So you've had presidents like James Madison, who wrote most of the Constitution. So he was sensitive to that. In the spirit of checks and balances, he did not want to be coercive or even pushy with Congress. He wanted to respect their autonomy, their independence as a separate branch. So just the way he worded everything in his speeches and in his letters, it was from a very humble tone, and saying, you know, you may want to consider this. I thought maybe that this might be a wise course of action, but put it under your consideration and see what you would like to do with it, et cetera, et cetera. But then we've had presidents, as time has gone on, who have taken on a more bold approach in addressing Congress, and they make it look more conservative. They make it look more like days when the Crown would meet with the Parliament and pretty much tell the Parliament what they were going to do, or else. For instance, Teddy Roosevelt. They called it the bully pulpit strategy. He would have a list of things that he felt needed to be addressed, certain wrongs that needed to be righted, and he would not so he wasn't very subtle, not so subtle about it. He would tell them if they do not address these issues, he was going to go over their head straight to the press and tell on them that they would not address the issues, and their constituents who had elected them and they rule over would become aware of it and become up in arms. So Teddy Roosevelt did that. Franklin Roosevelt did the same thing during the Great Depression, claimed that we were in a war against the Depression and that we were virtually in a state of war. So he told Congress what they needed to do and somewhat threatened them if they didn't. So I could see that going both ways. And then, of course, the president can be impeached and removed. All right, so that is enlightened. Then conservative with the president. He or she is elected by an electoral college system, right? Rather than by popular vote. So they go by the number of House reps, 1 for every 30,000, and senators, 2 no matter what. And that constitutes the number that state is worth. They win that state. Let's say you win 51% against 49%. You win all 40 whatever points of that state. The loser who got 49% of the vote in that California state gets none of it. Okay. And so it could happen that that loser can lose several states like that, just a couple percentages behind, and add them together. That loser of the few big states ends up beating the other guy on the popular vote, but the other guy beats him with the electoral points because it's winner takes all. So to a lot of people, they don't believe that's fair. It's not sufficiently democratic. Okay. So the electoral college has been called um, it's been called conservative for sure. You have to be a natural born citizen. If you're not born in the US, no matter how long you've been here as an immigrant, no matter how successful you are, how well you've assimilated to American culture, it doesn't matter. If you're not a natural born citizen, you can't run for president. So that's kind of conservative. Then patronage power. The kings and queens had patronage power, where they get to handpick people in their cabinet. They get to handpick their ambassadors, and ends up running to a lot. And then they usually defer federal patronage to smaller areas like the post office and this and that is run by the federal government. But all in all, it ends up being thousands and thousands of names that they get to handpick as if they were the crown. They have pardon power, right, over convicted criminals, just like kings and queens did. And shoot, can convene. I'm not sure what that was. I apologize. Article 1, Congress, Section 7, veto power over Congress. We've already mentioned that. And notice that these are conservative. Pragmatic, treaty power, and then also patronage power to form his own bureaucracy. A lot of people would contend that that is just a practical thing. Just because they happen to do it in the Middle Ages doesn't mean that we should automatically label it as conservative. That it's a very practical necessity to send people to represent our interest in other countries, etc., and for the president to appoint them and send them on their way. And then miscellaneous, enlightened, conservative, pragmatic. So Article 6, Constitution is the supreme law of the land. I definitely subjectively think that that is enlightened, because a written constitution, especially if it's influenced by the Enlightenment of French and Scottish, it's going to provide a lot of checks and balances, limitations of power, liberties preserved, etc. And not to mention, it doesn't change like people can change who rule. So there's a stability to it as well. Articles 3, 4, and 6, Supreme Court justices appointed for good behavior. Okay. Now recall, I will say one thing, because for sure, when you get to Article 3 and you have the Supreme Court handpicked by the president and they serve for good behavior, which basically is for life. I will say this thing to play devil's advocate is you have Congress ostensibly that is worried about angering the people, that has at least enough accountability by way of re-elections after their terms end, if they want to stay in there, to somewhat make the majority of voters happy. And the same thing goes with the president. Even though there's the electoral college, the president was elected by the people, and there's a sense of accountability to the people who voted him in when his 4 years come up. But without having been said, you know, you also have who is going to take care of then the numerical minority? Because you find that in certain democracies, right? You look at the democracy in Athens under a guy named Pericles, and it started well, and it ended up having like witch hunts, supposedly. And they would go after the nonconformists and go after scapegoats and so forth if you weren't in that inner accepted, you know, lot of people. And so there was no one in that democracy there to protect the numerical minority. All right. And that's exactly the purpose, according to Enlightenment thinking, for Supreme Court justices to serve for life, is that they should not base their decisions upon popularity. They should feel secure and know they're in there for the long haul, no matter what they decide. And so ostensibly, they'll be more apt to want to protect the minority. Okay? Not having to worry about making a popular decision. The fugitive slave law obviously was very conservative. All debts and property accounted in the property clause was very conservative. It says basically all contracts and debts that were secured prior to May of 1787, when they wrote the Constitution, are recognized and still valid now. And so first and foremost, what I think of is property. And I think of the founding fathers and how much land they owned. They said, okay, no land redistribution, because some radical people like Fourier, Saint-Simon, coming real soon will be the French Revolution, and they'll dabble in taking land from the rich to give it to the poor as part of their revolution. Our founding fathers were not that liberal. They were not that enlightened. They held on to their property, which included, in many cases, chattel property. Chattel property is movable property that you can move along with you, and sadly, that included slaves. Okay, so the debt, and then not to mention, if someone was indebted to them as creditors, they still owed them that money after the formation of this new government. And then Article 5, the amendment process and the Bill of Rights, clearly enlightened. All right, so I'm going to go back to the assignment. There. So I put 1. Article 1, Section 2. House reps are directly elected by citizens every 2 years and must be inhabitants of the congressional districts which they represent. Here is my rationale. And notice it's 1 sentence. This is enlightened because they are frequently held accountable to their constituents via or by way of election, and are privy to what their constituents face daily and having a residence in their constituents' environment. Conservative. Article 1, Section 2. In counting citizens to determine taxes and the number of House reps to serve in Congress from each state, the Constitution mentions that 3/5 of other persons and Native Americans do not count. This is conservative because just as in millennia past, the founding fathers did not embrace the courage and progressive tolerance to declare universal citizenship for all people. Pragmatic. Article 1, Section 8. That federal Congress can deal with practical issues like bankruptcies, inventions, borrowing money, defending the nation against revolts and invasions. This seems pragmatic, and that such issues will almost inevitably need to be dealt with sooner or later. So I ask you to give 3 more on each of these. So again, Article 1 is Congress, Article 2 is the executive, the president, and Article 3 is the Supreme Court. Does anybody have any questions? Is this somewhat clear? You guys are quiet today. By all means, if it's not, please let me know.
So I have a question. You said for each one we have to do 3 other ones?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
So try to find 3 examples of each one.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Here's another one that this is me, it's subjective, okay? But I tend to think of it as pragmatic. Section 2.2, no person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 and have been 7 years a citizen of the U.S. and shall have not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state in which he shall be chosen. I'm mainly focusing on age. I think an age requirement is not so ideological. I mean, unless they're like going from the writings of Plato and at what age people were ready for, service to the community and this and that, which they very well could have because they had a classical education. And I know Plato gave definitive ages. But to me, it's practical. 25, you're still so young, and you're limited in life experiences. You probably have had a nice education by then, but as far as life experiences, I don't know. I personally, subjectively think of that first one as pragmatic. To be 7 years a citizen of the state and to have a residence in that state where you're running. And then that seems that the last one I've already said seems enlightened. If you are, they want direct representation. They fought against Great Britain for that. Someone who lives in that state, in that congressional district, in that county, that area, knows what life is like there. That's direct representation. 7 years a citizen, I don't know. I don't know what to do on that one. But you could pick it apart and you could choose just the age or just the citizenship or just the inhabitant. I have no problem with that. Then also, let's see here. Some people would say that this is enlightened because back in England, you had the president messing with Senate elections. I mean, the King George III, and trying to manipulate Senate elections and appointments on Senate committees in his House of Lords. So it says here, right, that the Senate's going to be autonomous. They choose their own officers. They also choose a president of the Senate. And they come up with their own rules and protocol that have to be followed. I personally think of that as enlightened because it secures their autonomy, their independence in the spirit of checks and balances and having an independent department. Let's see here. Once in every year. And it's the same thing there on number 1 in section 5. Each house shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business, but a smaller number may adjourn from day to day. So they're autonomous. They have their own rules that they follow and accountable to one another with. You could expel a member. That's the journal one. I wanted to let me go to Article 2. And they make note of what should happen if, God forbid, the president should die in office. Let's see here. Right here, number 6. In case of the removal of the president from office by impeachment, or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president, and the Congress may by law provide for the case of removal, death, resignation, or inability, both of the president and vice president, declaring what officer shall then act as president. And such officer shall act accordingly until the disability be removed, or a president shall be elected. So you could have an interim president if, God forbid, the president were removed and then it goes next to the vice president and the vice president somehow got removed. Then Congress decides on an interim president until they can have new elections for a new president. So I definitely think that is pragmatic, trying to practically, deal with a contingency that could arise. That's the State of the Union. And then look at here. Here is the direct jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So supposedly, right, in section 2, if it falls directly under one of these, the Supreme Court constitutionally, supposedly, doesn't have a choice. They have to address it. It's when it does not fall into these categories that they have, which you probably have heard of, and I have too, the discretion to throw stuff out and say, nope, we're not touching that one. We'll pick this one instead. They have latitude to do that, right? But under that which is put in the Constitution, is supposed to be under their direct jurisdiction, so which implies they have no choice. So in law and equity arising under this Constitution, the laws of the U.S. and treaties made to all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, to all cases of admiralty, and maritime jurisdiction, to controversies in which the U.S. is one party, controversy between two or more states, between a state and citizens of another state, between citizens of different states, between citizens of the same state claiming lands under grants of different states, and between a state or the citizens thereof and foreign states, citizens or subjects. So anyway, and it goes on number 2. And so, I don't know. Subjectively, I feel like it is pretty much inevitable that from the time they wrote this up till now, that virtually every one of these cases, these scenarios, have arisen multiple times, and they needed to be addressed, and the Supreme Court had to do it. So I personally lean toward pragmatic on that. That's just me. The trial of all crimes, except in cases of impeachment, shall be by jury. That's enlightened. The trial of your peers. They have to be the state in which the crimes were committed. All right. And then when you get into the amendments, look at the 10th one. The powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively. So it's important to note, we devised, right, a constitutional, because theoretically, the Constitution is the source of the authority of our government. It gives our government its legitimacy to rule over us. And it's the ultimate arbiter of what they can and cannot do. So we have a constitutional federal republic. And the federal part, right, is a balance between a unitary government when a strong central, distant, centralized government dictates everything. They would determine law even in the cities and in the small towns, would come all the way from DC. Okay, we don't have that. And between that and a confederacy, and as you saw, confederacies, the states are almost autonomous, and just under special circumstances like an invasion, a large rebellion, do they have to unite? And so what we did is we try to do a balance in having a unitary like government with a much stronger central government in DC, but reserving some autonomy and some rights also to the states. And that's the federal part. And I consider that enlightened. And then the republic is like Rome. You had elected tribunes, yes, but you had unelected senators above them. And then the unelected senators elected the two consuls, who were the presidents. So it was a combination of directly elected citizens and hand-picked people in the Senate, and then the consuls who were who were elected by unelected senators, right? And so it was a balance of representative democracy and a little bit of aristocracy. And so that's what we have, a constitutional federal republic. So notice on Article 1, Section 8, when you see that long list of powers that Congress gets, you notice that it doesn't say anything about slavery. And boy, is that going to encourage drama in the future. When the Southerners say, well, you don't have the constitutional right to tell the states what to do about slavery. Here it is right here. Taxes, pay debts, borrow money, regulate trade, deal with naturalization and immigration, coin money and do weights and measures, deal with counterfeiting, establish post offices, engage in a patent system for inventors to promote science. Tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. So the circuit courts, right, that used to travel around by horseback beneath the Supreme Court, in many ways, they were put together by Congress. Supreme Court didn't make these lower levels of judges. Congress did. Define and punish piracies and felonies on the high seas. To declare war. Okay, make rules about it. To raise and support an army. That means telling the states that they have to give their militia over to the federal government. To provide and maintain a navy. Naval forces. Call forth the militia from the states. Okay. Number 17 is Washington, D.C. It has separate sovereignty, kind of like Vatican City in Rome. It's its own kind of autonomous city, federal city. But look at number 18. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So if you can reason in doing something and say, okay, yes, it's not on this list. We understand that. But it's necessary and proper to do number 6 on this list. It ultimately has often gone to the Supreme Court. And they've made the final decision on that. And what you're going to get to soon, and you're probably already familiar with, is Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, devises a national bank. And we didn't cover that, did we, in this section? But he says that because they have to lay and collect taxes, that because they have to regulate interstate trade, that it is necessary and proper for them to build a bank. And for him, it worked. The Supreme Court agreed with him. So if you're libertarian, fearful of big government, this necessary and proper clause is way too conservative. It's like a blank check that the federal government could possibly use and abuse to do whatever it wants. All right. So notice nothing is written about the establishment of educational institutions, public schools, colleges. Nothing's mentioned about police forces, right? Nothing's mentioned about institutions for caring for the sick, a system of hospitals, etc. So people would make the argument that because it's not on here and because of the 10th Amendment that we just read, then it's reserved to the states, that those ought to be state issues. All right. Have I helped at all? Do you guys feel any better on this?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Just making sure I have all your names. So that's it. That's it, ladies. Just please put 3 more under each section, and 1 sentence is fine with me. After each one, tell me why, in your estimation, it's enlightened, why it's conservative, why it's pragmatic. And I hope I was pretty clear in my definitions, my subjective definitions of those 3 terms. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I hope we're good, okay?
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Como siempre, always. I look forward to seeing you guys, and just thank you for being faithful. And I will continue to give you 5 extra points on each of these assignments.
Have a good night. We'll see you next week.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too. Thank you.